If nothing succeeds like success, then nothing fails like failure. And what a failure it was following the destruction of Jerusalem's great temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. The prevailing mood in the land of Israel was of total despair. We read of those whose lives are so consumed with grief that they are known as mourners of Zion, Evlei Tzion. Ancient Jewish literature records them as saying, "Blessed is he who was not born, or he who, having been born, has died. But as for us who live, woe unto us, because we see the afflictions of Zion, and what has befallen Jerusalem. And let not the brides adorn themselves with garlands, and ye women, pray not that ye may bear. Or why, again, should mankind have sons? Or why should the seed of their kind again be named, where this mother is desolate, and her sons are led into captivity?" Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch 10, 6-7, 9, 10, 13-16. It could easily be argued that without a temple, the Jewish people would likely have gone extinct. After all, isn't that what naturally happens to conquered people down through the centuries? Yet something new and inexplicable was about to happen that would change the course of history. It all has to do with a venerable Pharisaic sage named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who, along with his disciples, was caught up in the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans. He had no sympathy for a revolt that had no chance of success, and his only desire was to rescue himself and his disciples from certain doom. He pretended to be dead and had two of his disciples carry his casket with their teacher out of the city. Emerging from the casket, he went on to proclaim that the Roman general Vespasian would someday become emperor. This obviously pleased Vespasian, who promptly granted the request of his Jewish captive that a center for the study of Torah be established at a city near the Mediterranean coast called Yavne. This became the new center of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith, the first time the center had moved from Jerusalem since the days of King David. It was a revolutionary event. It represented a new foundation for Judaism, with no temple and no sacrifice. One time, when Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was walking in Jerusalem with Rabbi Yehoshua, they arrived at the place where the temple now stood in ruins. Rabbi Yehoshua cried out, "Oy lanu al ze, shehu harav makom shemekaprim bo avonotehem shel Israel." Rabban Yochanan answered, "Bni, al yira lecha, yesh lanu kapara achat shehi kemota, ve'ezo zo, gmilut hasadim, shene'emar ki chesed chafatzti, ve'lo zevach. Kol zman shebet hamikdash kayam, mizbeach mekaper al Yisrael, ve'achshav shulchano shel adam mekaper alav." In those days, it was a radical concept. But it was just the beginning. At Yavne, prayer would be standardized. The formal canon of the Hebrew Scriptures would be fixed. The first rabbis would be formally ordained in a ritual that would be known to this day as smicha, and the oral traditions of the Pharisees would be organized and formalized. The whole body of Jewish law would come to be known as halakha, which literally means walking. There is a pathway to walk involving all manner of traditions and customs, including what one may eat and what one is not to eat. Kashrut, or kosher. The Council of Sages at Yavne would come to comprise a new authoritative body, a new Sanhedrin. Among the many sayings attributed to Yochanan ben Zakkai is this: Chayechem lo hamet metame, velo hametim metaharim, ela gezirato shel melech malachei hamlachim. We also read, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. He used to say, Im lamadat haTorah harbe, al tachazik tova la'atzmecha, ki lechach notzarta. Amazingly, over time, the devastated land and its population began to recover. Do you suppose, Watson, that Rabbi Yochanan, for all his stringent piety, should actually be considered quite radical? And do you suppose we could even argue that he single-handedly saved Judaism and the Jewish people from sure extinction? As time passed, the Sanhedrin, which later moved to the Galilee, would come to be led by a new rabbinic leader at its helm, namely Gamliel II. By now, this leader was known by the term Nasi, or prince. As Yochanan ben Zakkai's successor, he rendered immense service in the strengthening and reintegration of Judaism. He put an end to the division which had arisen between the spiritual leaders of Judaism by separation of the scribes into the two schools called, respectively, after Hillel and Shammai. Eventually, it was agreed that halakha would be determined according to the more liberal house of Hillel. Gamliel's position was even recognized by the Roman government. And that government was going through some major changes of its own. The Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 of the Common Era, was succeeded by his son Titus, who ruled until 81 CE. Titus was followed by Domitian, emperor until the year 96, at which time he was murdered, putting an end to the Flavian dynasty. Thankfully for Jews, that also put an end to the anti-Jewish regulations in place under the Flavian emperors. Nerva took the throne of Rome and ruled until the year 98. Next came Trajan, the conquering general who hailed from Spain and now took the reins of power. Trajan was known for extending the boundaries of the Roman Empire to its farthest dimensions, embracing the whole of continental Europe, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. In 117 CE, the Jews of Parthia rose up against the Romans during the War of Kitos, and several major Jewish communities in Cyprus, Libya, Alexandria, and Mesopotamia were decimated. But it wasn't in the Roman interest to attempt a total massacre of the Jews. It wouldn't have sat well with other conquered peoples who might think they were next. When Hadrian came to power in 117, he inaugurated, at least at first, an atmosphere of tolerance. He even talked of allowing the Jews to rebuild the temple. But then he changed course dramatically. He formulated a plan to transform Jerusalem into a pagan city-state on the Greek polis model, with a shrine to Jupiter on the site of the Jewish temple. Then he did the unthinkable. He issued a total ban on the practice of circumcision. It amounted to an open declaration of war against Judaism itself. And Hadrian's Jewish subjects would fight it at all cost. In those days, a rabbinical sage of piety and rectitude arose to lead Israel. His name was Akiva. His origins were humble. He was but an uneducated shepherd until the age of 40, whereupon he began a life of study and contemplation. After 15 long years of study, he made an incredible ascent to the throne of authority as an adjudicator and leader of his people. When the great rabbinical court, the Sanhedrin, moved north from Yavne to a town in Galilee called Usha, Rabbi Akiva ascended to its helm. Akiva was convinced that a supreme intelligence had communicated the Holy Scriptures to Israel, and that this same supreme intelligence had inspired every word of the sacred text. Not only is every word inspired, but every letter of every word has a definitive meaning and value. Even the decorative spurs and assorted crownlets adorning the letters have precise significance. Akiva tuned his soul so as to discover the deeper hidden meanings in the Torah. In one passage, the prophet called Bil'am or Balaam declares, Er'enu velo ata, Ashurenu velo karov, Darach kochav miYaakov, Vekam shevetz meYisrael. Surely, this must be a reference to the Messiah, the anointed king who will someday bring the people into a glorious redemption. One day, Akiva met his Messiah. He came not from Jerusalem, but from a small, out-of-the-way village called Kosiba. He was called Simon, son of Kosiba. In Hebrew, Shimon ben Kosiba. He was a rebel, an anti-Roman agitator of charismatic personality, and a fanatic's determination. Akiva became convinced that this was the Mashiach, the Messiah, and he was destined to sit as king upon the throne of David. Akiva began to play with the name of his newly found Messiah and decided that the town of Kosiba sounds hauntingly similar to another word, Kochba, the Aramaic rendering of the Hebrew Kochav, meaning star. Recalling that a star, a Kochav, shall come forth out of Jacob, Akiva decreed that this Messiah should henceforth be known as Shimon bar Kochba, son of the star. With Rabbi Akiva's blessing, Bar Kochba ascended the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. There he commanded that a sacrifice be offered in accordance with the commandments of the Torah, only without a temple. By now, the time was ripe for a second wind of rebellion in the face of ultimate tyranny. The year was 132 of the Common Era, when the land of Israel exploded in a second great revolt against the masters of the world. As during the first revolt of 66 to 70 CE, the rebels were ill-equipped to take on the might of the empire. Judea was still only a buffer zone bordering Parthia, backwater province on the edge of the desert. If the Judeans had any hope of success, they needed the full support of the Jews of Galilee to the north. But Galilee had no desire to suffer the wrath of Rome again, and Judea would have to go it alone. The rebels scored some early victories, to be sure. The Roman 22nd Legion poured into the land from Egypt, only to be utterly wiped out. But the desperate rebels were no match for the well-trained, well-armored, red-plumed legionnaires who filled the Roman ranks. Within 3 years, it would all be over. Swooping down on little Judea, the legions gave no quarter to the beleaguered Bar Kokhba. The Jewish general deposited his frantic correspondence in a cave along the western shore of the Dead Sea, where they would be discovered 19 centuries later, along with the remains of the ancient Essene library, known collectively as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The last stand of the freedom fighters took place at a town in central Judea called Beitar. The rebels fought bravely to the end, only to be overwhelmed in a sea of blood. Among the dead was Simon, Shimon, son of Kosiba, Shimon Bar Kokhba. The Roman historian Dio Cassius tells us, "Thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate, of which the people had had forewarning before the war. The tomb of Solomon, which the Jews regarded as an object of veneration, fell to pieces of itself and collapsed, and many wolves and hyenas rushed howling into the cities. Many Romans, however, perished in this war. Therefore, Hadrian, in writing to the Senate, did not employ the opening phrase commonly affected by emperors, 'If you and your children are in health, it is well, and I and my legions are in health.'" Clearly, though victorious, the troops were not well. So ended the final hope for messianic deliverance from Rome. One enduring memory from this sad era relates to the fate of Rabbi Akiva himself. The venerable sage survived the din of battle only to be captured by his Roman enemies. The Romans stretched out his body on the rack and proceeded to tear off his flesh with metal tongs. In his final agony, Akiva did not flinch with pain nor succumb to the temptation to curse his torturers. With all courage, he began chanting the words of the supreme declaration of his faith, the Shema. "Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad." The executioner, astounded at such composure, queried, "Are you a sorcerer?" But Akiva was only a mystic, gratified at the opportunity to display his love for the Almighty by his glorious martyrdom. With "Hear, O Israel," on his lips, Akiva gave up his spirit, entered the orchard once again, to return to this world no more. A mystical legend relates that at the moment of his death, a voice issued forth from the heavens in the hearing of all, announcing, "Happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul went out with that word, one." 2 centuries of Roman rule had left a horrific legacy. The Emperor Hadrian, for his part, purposed to blot out the very memory of Jews from the land. Looking back through history, it was noticed that the land had once been occupied by various Canaanite tribes, including the Philistines. what better retribution than to rename the land of Israel after them? Playing with the word Philistine, it would henceforth be known in Latin as Palestina, Palestine. Jerusalem itself would be renamed Aelia Capitolina. On the sacred Temple Mount, Hadrian's pagan sanctuary would be erected, a temple to Jupiter. The land was so devastated that it could barely support its population. The center of the faith had moved from Yavne to Usha in the Galilee, where yet another rabbinical giant, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, or Judah the Prince, oversaw the editing of the oral law into what became known as the Mishnah. Eventually, the Sanhedrin moved on to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. There would always remain pockets of Jews in the land of Israel, but the majority of the people over the generations to come made the slow trek eastward, away from Roman hegemony, to Babylonia. There, yet new centers of the faith would emerge, and a new body of Jewish literature, the Babylonian Talmud. Through all of this, it's possible to advance a curious argument that the Jewish people survived not in spite of two disastrous revolts against Rome, but precisely because of them. For up until these two revolts, the Jewish people were well integrated into the fabric of Greco-Roman culture. Over the centuries, they would likely have suffered the same fate as Rome itself and her proud citizenry: slow decline, assimilation among surrounding peoples, and eventual extinction. But that was not to be their fate. Instead, as the Jews secluded themselves in the East, among their holy books, they avoided the shared fate of the classical world. When Rome fell, the now thriving Jewish academies in Babylonia continued on, unhindered. Once again, the Jewish people survived by a strange fluke of history. It's all elementary.